Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning, afternoon in Switzerland, in Dubai, wherever in the world, and welcome to the Swiss Pavilion. My name is Dante Larini. I'm project manager at the Swiss Pavilion, and I work for Swissnex. Swissnex is an agency of the Swiss government to promote education, research, innovation of Switzerland abroad, and connect it with local equivalents from the entire world, from the world's most innovative hotspots. And we are doing so at the Pavilion to promote our universities, our researchers, our startups, our innovative companies, and put them in connection with equivalents from the UAE, the region, and the entire world. We have partnered up for the Health and Wellness Week with the Swiss School of Public Health. We have developed a series of events looking at public health from the lenses of the 17 SDGs. Yesterday, we looked at public health in terms of nutrition, for example. We also are looking at public health in terms of its connections with art, and thanks to our colleagues from the SUPSI, through physical theatre, thanks to our colleagues from the Academia Dimitri. And so today we are going to start our second day of events here at the Swiss Pavilion. Without further ado, I would like to present our Master of Ceremony for today, Dr. Emily Reeves, who is going to talk you through the session today. Emily, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for those who are tuning in online. I know that we're 5 minutes behind schedule. But welcome to the SSPH Plus for Sustainable Health event program. Today is day 2, as Dante mentioned. And I'm Emily Reeves. I'm the project manager for this project at the Swiss School of Public Health. For those of you who are not familiar with the Swiss School of Public Health, we are the national coordinating body for the promotion of postgraduate research and education in Switzerland, and we are affiliated with 12 universities in Switzerland. Today we have a session on health in the urban space where we invite experts from Switzerland to share their research and knowledge in this field with us. And it's my pleasure to be able to present this morning or this afternoon, depending where you're tuning in from, this first speaker. And it's a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Filippo Bignami from the Department of Economics, Health and Social Sciences, Dias Lucci, Labour, Urbanscape and Citizenship Research Area, University of Applied Sciences and Arts of Southern Switzerland, SUPSI, and he will be talking to us today about platform urbanization between smart city narrative and urban citizenship shortage. Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to leave the floor to you, and he is joining us online.
Thank you, Emily, for the introduction. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me first?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me and see? So, can you see my screen shared?
We hear you and we see you perfectly.
Okay, so now I think that you have also my screen.
Perfect.
Okay. So, thank you again for the introduction. I'll briefly introduce you some pieces of our work, let's say, and particularly in this my short presentation of platform urbanization, I would remind that we are working on this conceptualization of this process together with a colleague, Naomi Anakata, and we are having this developments of the work actually in publication on different journals and different projects. And we work with the colleague of Lucy, Labour, Urbanscape and Citizenship Research Area. One of them is Nicola Cuppini, that you will listen later on. So allow me to first say that the presentation is structured in introducing the concept of this process of platform urbanization that we are defining. then the implication on citizenship, and a very, very brief outlook on which could be an urban scenario for a conception of smart city, and in particular smart city, including a notion and the concept of digital citizenship. So I'll start with introducing platform urbanization. So let me, okay. So we start from the consideration that the urban realm is slowly but steadily defined, influenced, and structured around platform infrastructure. For administering the city, for managing, for delivering services, and we had just a powerful example of this in the COVID-19 inrush, where manifold services and manifold measures are administered through platforms. This also brings us to say that there is a sort of techno-positivist narrative around what is the smart city. So we are somehow observing these definitions and this wide conception of smart city, observing that we have to pay attention also with this technological narrative that is supposed to solve the problems by technology, which poses, of course, positive aspects, but a lot of questions. In effect, platform transforms the way people come together, interact, and produce and experience urban space. So platforms are slowly but steadily influencing and shaping a new way of coming together, defining de facto a new environment, because they transform the way we plan, manage, or predict urban development, are infused in every aspect of our urban development. Because they transform the capacities and possibilities citizens have to carry out their rights and duties. So this means that in this, allow me to be trivial and very short in this definition, but in this, allow me to say, new environment, the forms of participation as well are changing, because we are in a new form and in a new process of urbanization, which we are defining platform urbanization, driven or deeply influenced by platforms. So our urbanization processes are led and are deeply infused by technologies which consist in different aspects of the platform. I don't enter right now, because there is not the time, on what we consider platform. But in any case, we have to say that this process we see as a planetary condition, not, of course, limited to specific settlements or specific cities. Of course, in the urban areas, this process of platform urbanization is more visible and more, let's say, captable and more evident, but this is a planetary condition we consider. And furthermore, we consider that this goes beyond of course, the confines and the borders of nation states, because it's a global condition with specificities in each context, of course. In fact, as I am saying, it's not. It is a new layer of uneven geographies of power, access, and the ability to co-produce the urban that varies from context to context, but it is global, local for effects and forms, but global as a process. Again. Therefore, just to sum up, platforms are, as I said, infrastructure of a global process. The implication are manifold. In particular, the urban is seen as a hybrid form of online and offline interaction. As I mentioned, this is a new sort of environment in which we are immersed and in which we are called to participate. It's part of a process of dematerialization, abstraction, and dissociation, creation of a new technopolitical arena, de facto. So the related discourses that we have to call and that we have to, let's say, put on the table to understand which are the really key drivers of this process are to focus on material infrastructure, governance, human resources, and technology as a normative and enabling device, because we have to cope also with these infrastructures, with these platforms, understanding that these are a new, or at least a not well-known interlocutor, a not well-known actor. So we investigate the planetary as well as specific implication of platform urbanization on our urban environment and relapses, legacies on citizenship. Okay, to close about platform urbanization, we have to say that in its different forms of governing, of, for example, contact tracing, or, for example, for delivery of services, for example, just mentioning essential workers, for different reasons, sanitary services, economic, and for managing the pandemic. We have seen and we are seeing that the platform urbanization process is having a steep acceleration due to the pandemic. Of course, also a greater dependency on platforms and introducing new ones for control, surveillance, and monitoring of COVID-related matters. Yes, in this sense, we mean, for example, in different areas, in different urban areas in particular, many measures are introduced to control the movements, to track social contacts, and so on. And some of them are less invasive, but some of them are quite more matters much more in terms of freedom of movements and so on. So the integration dependent on the degree to which platform urbanization was already established, as I said, because we see it as a global process, but of course in different contexts and applied and evident in different degrees and levels. So we see platform urbanization composed, if we want, you see in the graph, in the triangle, on three basically concepts, which is the concept of citizenship, so to understand how to exercise its rights, observe duties, and how to participate, how to concretely and obtaining an effect in participation. Urban environment, of course, it's an environment, as I have just briefly depicted, material, but also equally immaterial. And how to govern, how happens this governance. So how this process of extensive use of platforms is governed and administrative, with which regulation, with which controls, for example, with which rules, with which level of autonomy, and so on. This is very, very important, of course, on aspects of citizenship, as I briefly mentioned, because because this process of platform urbanization implies a modification of, for example, level of participation, people that are allowed or not to participate, inclusion or exclusion for different groups of people. It is a multi-layered process also on the implication on citizenship, in particular, of course, on the urban dimension of citizenship, because we are in this sense merging urban platform urbanization and citizenship. It's evident that we are in an environment with a political scenario where institutional order at multiple levels, urban, but nation states, territorial, and also supranational, big tech companies and economic forces deeply affect and continuously challenge the notion of citizenship itself, because we have to understand that we are in the presence of a need to reshape to some extent the notion of citizenship. This is due to an intimate imbalance. On one hand, organizers and providers of this scenario are always or almost always private oligopolies. On the other hand, users and supposedly digital citizens are often ill-informed regarding the platform ecosystem they navigate through on a daily basis, voluntary or not, because of course we are, as I mentioned, we are immersed in a techno-political scenario in a platform. Also, the paradox is that we are in this scenario also not using neither, for example, a smartphone, for example. We are anyhow immersed in it. The city, in this sense, is a techno-political environment of platform urbanization where various layers and actors interplay within a territory of urban digital citizenship, as I mentioned. In this case, for example, nation states creating and controlling platform ecosystems, their incentives sometimes clash with global tech market players that design, produce, sell, and profit from platforms, as well as not only, of course, for nation states, but in particular for urban areas. Therefore, in this complex techno-political scenario, there is a particular kind of political leverage inherent in these intersections that seems unattainable exactly for single citizens. Appears then the need to find an adequate space, both material and immaterial, in the urban, able to exploit the opportunities or cope with the fallout of tectonic movement and frictions, as Minas said in 2020. So the current techno-political scenario of platform urbanization has disrupted conventional politics based on nation states and further is creating new kinds of political without precedence. Platforms have given rise to new spaces and subjects of politics, highlighting how historical and traditional assemblages of territory, authority, and rights linked to the nation states have been and are being resettled and reorganized. Furthermore, the other point is that these new assemblages have created the need to extend, as I mentioned, to extend the concept of citizenship in three main directions, basically, regarding inclusion of many politically, linguistically, technologically, and culturally different forms of interaction, as I mentioned, enabling participation, in consideration of different typologies of citizenship, of citizen communities, for example, urban ones, migrant, platform-based, and so on, for example, group of platform and so on, and with respect to a validity beyond the nation state as a physical anchorage and beyond a formal conceptual contour. Seems, therefore, necessary to pick a suitable locus, a place, where new forms of citizenship can be co-constructed, negotiated, and set apart from a collectivity aiming towards a performative interpretation of citizenship. Citizenship staged in the urban environment reflects then the political capacity and right to reshape the city in presence of different regimes of citizenship. The digital, in particular, with highly important. So, as a matter of thing, seems important to define and to equip the citizens to understand that we are confronted with new forms of political mediation for a performative interpretation of citizenship. Particularly, this is valid, of course, and this is valid everywhere. But in particular, this is more impressive and more consistent in the urban areas. Therefore, just to sum up about the implication of citizenship, we can see that if the city is a place where citizenship is defined concretely, operatively, let's say, is defined by the dynamics of platform urbanization, it forces us to consider the aspect of technopolitics as a forefront of the urban environment, as I said. Internet, therefore, is slowly but steadily eroding and replacing political institutional spaces, becoming the real global institution, as Mathiasson already understood in 28. Therefore, it means, as I sketched before, but allow me to say it again and stress again, exercising citizenship in a context of platform urbanization is not just a matter of participating in a predefined realms. That is to say, it's not necessary just to be able to use technological devices. This is important. It's not just a matter of understanding technically or understanding how to participate in a predefined picture of technology and of platforms. But rather, it becomes mainly a matter of creating new and different types of communities, of collectivity, and or sometimes transforming participation in urban politics, in community and society. Online, understanding that it implies to be able to act online and offline, enacting political scopes and repositioning participatory process in the, I would say, and repositioning participatory process, I would say, in the smart city. Therefore, let me conclude really briefly to share with you what we are defining, what we are elaborating on what is necessary, what's at stake for going towards an urban scenario for a smart city, implying, let's say, an effective definition and effective practical notion of digital citizenship. It implies to work on individual skill, to nurture and to, let's say, to cross-fertilize collective urban skills, because it means that if one citizenship implies a link between individual and collectivities, but also in vertical sense with the institution, with the political aggregate, with the political construction in the city. So we have to work, I think it's needful to work on individual skills in this sense. Then there is the aspect of critical use of technologies and of platforms, of course, in favor of co-constructed form of citizenship. It means to debate, to simply discuss upon the role of platforms and upon the way these platforms are used and administered. Because, as I said, almost always, except only in limited cases, they are administered and managed by private oligopolies. So it means to balance, not counteract maybe, but to balance a deterministic and techno-optimistic standpoint of platforms viewing citizenship as data repository. We think that we have to debate and we have to put in discussions the aspect of techno-positivism that is fed to some extent from the smart city conception. Platform urbanization is Yes, sure. Last 2 point, platform urbanization. It is important to understand this process to dialogue and valorize the enrichment of urbanization vocabulary as a collective patrimony, because we think that platform urbanization process has to be understood widely. And last, and then I conclude, immaterial political arena versus openness to be concretely co-constructed, because we have to understand that the implication on material and immaterial aspects starts from a political immaterial arena to obtain concretely effects and concretely impact on the urban making and in urban policy making. I do apologize for my little delay, and then I close my presentation, thanking you for your attention and being, of course, fully available to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you. Hopefully you can hear the round of applause here from your microphone and from your headset. Thank you very, very much. Sorry that we're on a bit of a schedule, but it was a pleasure to hear you and to hear from your knowledge and expertise in this research area. Now is a time where we'd love to invite those who have any questions or feedback to what you have spoken to us about today to provide this feedback or questions. If you're joining us online, then please use the chat function. On the live stream, you can actually write questions underneath and we will receive them. And our technical team will inform us of your questions. For those of us who are sitting here live at the Swiss Pavilion in Dubai, does anybody have a question that they would like to ask? Yes.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Professor, for this very interesting lecture. I just had a question regarding mental health and the cities of tomorrow. As you know,
I'm sorry, but I'm not hearing.
Okay, how about now?
Loudly.
Can you hear me now?
Seems better, please.
Okay. Thank you, Professor, for the lecture. I have a question regarding the impact of mental health in cities, especially after the pandemic. In your opinion, how can cities, urbanization, urban planning better take measures to improve the mental health of its citizens? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Concerning mental health, to be honest, it's not my field, and so I am not able to provide a specific answer related to, let's say, health or sanitary policies in this term. But I would say that of course, the inrush of pandemic is bringing with it a deep acceleration of use of platforms in terms of control, in terms of contact tracings, in terms of recognition of behaviors, in provision and in modeling several aspects of our daily life. So I would say that in general terms, but I am convinced about that, if we could share, in particular in some contexts where this ability and this skill is not so developed, I would say that being able to participate in the process, to have a say somehow in the process, could avoid a sense of exclusion, a sense of being aside of a whole process, and therefore promoting and improving the feeling of be part of a mechanism, be part of a machine that is going towards a common aim, rather than the opposite, as is happening in some contexts, and due to the extensive use of platforms that often only request a passive use of them. But I think that it goes from social media, for example, till, of course, the management of data and the collection of data that are used for commercial purposes or whatever. I would say that in particular in this context, giving a measure floor to understanding in which way the citizens can participate might be benefiting also for this purpose.
Thank you very much, Dr. Filippo Bignami. It's been a pleasure. And with that, I think in the interest of time, we move on to the next session. Thank you so much for your time. And the next speaker is actually, in fact, joining us live here at the Swiss Pavilion in Dubai, and is not only the head of unit at the Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute, but is in fact also the director of the Swiss School of Public Health and an expert in this field. He'll be talking to us about clean air in urban spaces. It is possible if you want. So I'll introduce to you Nino Künzli and let him take over from here.
Thank you.
Emily, thank you very much. It's my very big pleasure to stay here live in Dubai. It's the first time I'm in Dubai, in the Swiss Pavilion. And as Emily mentioned, I have two hats. Is the technology all right? Okay, so people hear me. Okay, let me check. So I have to move the slide with this. It's not moving, not really moving. So I have two hats. Yes, I'm 50% the Dean of the Swiss School of Public Health, but now actually I stand here as my other hat with 50%. I'm a scientist at Swiss Tropical Public Health Institute since many years. And my field is actually air pollution and health. And this session is about urban health. I would have very much like to introduce and show you and present you here Professor Nicole Probst-Hensch, who leads this fantastic, very large Department of Epidemiology and Public Health at Swiss TPH, and she's an expert also in urban health. She would have a lot to say to you. But we had this very short-term change of that lecture, so I stepped in, and it was for Nicole, unfortunately, not possible to make this very fast move and step in. So it's my pleasure to talk about air pollution. And yes, you can move to the next slide, please. That is a very good idea, because here you have a PCR code. I want you to respond to this question. It's a question on the quiz that the community of the Swiss School of Public Health has created, and actually one question I have written, and it's you should visit, of course, the SUPSI-designed website with the quiz. So what is your answer to this question? I give you a few more seconds, and unfortunately you will not see the answers yourself. I will see them on my screen here. Hopefully, a few more seconds. Those in the room, just tell me when you feel like you were able to do your online job. I see Dante is fast, and others are very fast, and others are still working a bit on the links. Yeah, so during the past 30 years, how did ambient air quality change in the cities, in the mega cities around the globe? What do you think? Did it get worse or better or both? Yeah, look what your answers are. So I see that 29% thought it's getting worse, 14% vote for better, and 57% vote for saying it's both. Well, I will show you much more on that in the next 15 or 10 minutes. It's my pleasure. So I just had to turn a bit around my technology. Good. So I move forward and will tell you more about this air pollution, just for those who are not so much in the field, just a reminder, this has many, many, many sources, and that's true all over the world, although the sources differ in different places of the world. And combustion is a key issue still today if it's about air pollution. It's a complex mixture of many, many pollutants, of gases, and of particles. And particles have become very famous in research because now we know a lot about the effects of particles. And as you see, actually, the fine particles, they have the size of a virus. And now in the last 2 years, we had time to learn a lot about what it means to be exposed to particles of that size. So particulate matter are a very important element of that. And now I show you immediately the answer to my question to then go into this topic in more in-depth. It is true in many, many countries in the world, in all Western countries, all Europe, East and Western Europe. That's what you have seen over the last 30 years, a drastic improvement in air quality. But you have all these other countries where you have seen the opposite, and actually some of them were already the most polluted ones, and they go up and up and up. So that is a topic, and this improvement, I will show you the Swiss data on improvement, but just to give you an example what happened in Switzerland. When I grew up 50, 60 years ago in kindergarten here in Davos, my air quality that I would inspire on my way to school was worse at that time in this beautiful alpine city than it is today in the worst street in the city of Zurich or Bern. Yeah, so it's so much has changed, so much improved. Yeah, so why should we keep clean air? Why should air be kept clean? Well, there are several topics. I just want to touch on those a bit. Originally, and this was a movement from the United States, very much driven by people's wishes to have good visibility in their fantastic natural parks. So it was clear that people wanted to see very far, and visibility is of course an issue with air pollution. But then in the last 30 years, the discussions around health came very much into place, and that's also because of our science. We have all contributed to that. So in fact, the World Health Organization estimates today, based on the current evidence, that some 4 million per year of premature deaths can be attributed to air pollution. And that is a very, very high share. It's the biggest environmental share, actually. It's much more even than AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis taken together. So this is a very large burden. But we should not forget the others. Crop, very important crop for nutrition, actually. Soya, beans, wheat, it depends a bit where you go and which pollutant you look at. Ozone, it's a very, very strong toxicant for these plants. So they reduce the crop, the harvest by 10-15%, yeah, depending on the region. Buildings, the damage to buildings, those who live in Asian cities know that, how dirty these buildings got, the Notre Dame and many others, we know that, or in Rome, or you name it, in all the big cities in the world. So this damage to the building, and the sum up of all that is huge economic costs. So air pollution has a strong economic impact. And in fact, the United States, who were kind of leading the movement toward clean air, also from a policy perspective, they have calculated the costs and the benefits, and they have estimated some 20 years ago that the costs of clean air are about 30, of pollution are about 30 times higher than the costs of keeping air clean. Yeah? So it is a very, very efficient way of doing policy. For those who are interested in the health effects, this is a huge research behind, and you can follow up on our website. We have summarized it in nice graphs, actually. So today we know that air pollution is causing a whole range of cardiovascular, respiratory diseases, short-term effects, but also long-term effects. Even diabetes is on the roll. And you see this looks very similar to the smoking effects, actually. And of course, smoking is also combustion of fossil fuels. So this is just to tell you, and of course lung cancer is caused by air pollution, and on and on. This list gets longer every year due to the science that is done all over the world meanwhile. So how should we keep air clean? So that is, of course, an important question. And you see here kind of the top 4 approaches to how to keep the air clean. And yes, you need a legal framework. For those who were with us in the Majili last night, we had in the Terra Pavilion, this was a discussion. It's an illusion. Things will not happen without policies because it's so complex. People cannot even make those decisions. You need a policy framework. For example, the famous US Clean Air Act, which was established already in 1972, and many, many other countries followed later on. And then, of course, you need to go to the roots, to the problems, and the problems are the emission. So we should stop, we should regulate the emissions, and that is absolutely key approach to reduce emissions. You know, if you buy a car, a diesel car today, they are very, very clean in countries where they have the regulation that those diesel cars should have a filter. Yeah. If you don't have a filter on your diesel car, they are still very, very dirty soot producers, polluters. And then you need the science-based ambient air quality standard. So the government should say what the target is, so how clean air pollution should be. And I can tell you, in fact, the WHO, the World Health Organization, just published last year their new air quality guideline values. We worked on those for 5 years in discussing how to establish the new air quality guidelines. And the reason it took us so long is actually this new literature of the last 10, 15 years has very clearly shown that there is no threshold of no effect. So the higher the pollution is, the bigger is the burden, the health burden. So how do you establish a limit value under such a scheme? So we went to the entire literature to find the lowest level where we have strong scientific evidence for adverse effects. And you see, this is actually the stress here now for the countries who would like to comply their policies with the science. These new proposed air quality guidelines are even lower than they were since 2005. So standard setting is one thing, but of course you need to monitor. You need to monitor how air quality is. And for those who are interested in air quality in your place, you can follow this link. And I tell you, my talk is all about inequity. I started with showing you how unequal the development is. And if you go on this website on the world, you will see that. You will see the hotspots of air pollution. It is incredible how diverse this is. Yeah? So this is this monitoring. You need monitoring networks. And if you look, for example, on Africa in the map, you will realize that they do not even have the monitor stations. Yeah, they have very few monitor stations, so they are not even informed about how bad air quality is. Yeah, so I promised you to come back to these trends and, of course, to tell you the reason behind these trends. Yes, poor clean air policies means you don't get rid of that problem, and it's getting worse. So what is the outlook? What should we do? And this is actually, in my last 10 years of my career as a researcher, I have moved far more into providing advice to policymakers. I'm the chair of the Swiss Commission that advises the Swiss Council, actually, how to regulate air quality, air pollution. And I have to say, of course, from a Swiss perspective, I can be very happy, and I can show you the trends also for Switzerland. But from a global perspective, there is a need to call for the globalization of standards, globalization of emission standards, globalization of ambient air quality standards. And I'm completely convinced if we don't go that avenue, we will perpetuate a problem, which is a huge one. You see here how bad the situation is. If you look into how countries have adopted the WHO air quality guidelines in their regulation, it's just not good. It's not good enough. And that is the reason why things get worse. So what is behind this? This is not just governments who have a problem. Some of them actually are owners of the polluting industry, so they hesitate to regulate themselves. And of course, there is corruption in many countries where this is a problem, but it is a more globalized problem. If you do not globalize the standards, industries from all over the world will play with this as a business model. And this is just one example, because we are in the Swiss pavilion. These are Swiss companies. What they do, they sell the diesel in many, many African countries. And this is the dirtiest possible diesel. The dirtiest possible diesel, because the sulfur content, which is a very toxic part of the polluting part of diesel, is some 600 times higher than what the same companies would be allowed to sell in Switzerland. Yeah, it's just because that's the law. So it's nothing wrong. I mean, it's not they do something wrong. They just do what is allowed. And the Swiss companies are, of course, not the only one. I mean, there are many, many globalized companies who do exactly this type of playing with the standards. And actually, this study has created an outcry in African countries, and many have immediately adopted European levels for sulfur, yeah, which is actually very easy. And not even costly for them. Yeah, so you see here, this is the other story. That's the Swiss perspective. It's incredible how much air quality has improved. Now we have reached a point where all stations, the federal measuring stations, are in compliance with the former WHO air quality guidelines. So this is a huge success, and I think we should share this success on a global scale and help other countries, in fact, to go the same avenue, to implement these rules, policies, and actually the management plans. Of course, you need locally tailored management plans because air pollution differs across the globe. It's not everywhere the same. But all those countries who have seen these improvements have a lot to share with, and I would very much hope that at the next Expo 3 years from now we have made progress on a global scale in this. Yeah, so this is actually all I would like to share with you, and Emily, I get back to you to moderate the discussion.
Thank you very much for this very, very interesting talk, and it's great to have an expert coming to us live here in the Swiss Pavilion, all the way from Switzerland. So one of the things that we can do is take questions, as I mentioned before, from the virtual platform. If there are no questions virtually, then I would invite those who have questions here live to be able to ask Nino here directly. Do we have any questions? Yes.
Thank you for your talk. There was you mentioned the globalization of standards. Now my question is, what was actually the original cause of the immense pollution in those poor countries? Because I think that there is a conflict of interest with globalization as a whole, where you think that globalization is the cause of this pollution, and how do we change it that there is a new standard of globalization with regard to air pollution?
Well, thank you very much. It's a complex question for a complex issue. Of course, globalization is a reality, and all I'm saying is we also need to globalize how we deal with this new economic reality. It's not enough to just move things around. And actually, a study has shown very clearly where pollution happens, for what. So all the Western countries, including Switzerland, we are directly profiting from pollution in China, for example, because we have outsourced the dirty production to those countries. And I mean, they have shown that in very clear numbers. Yeah. So there is a missing piece element in this globalization. It's not enough to just say, well, we move production around the world and we transport things. You have to integrate these costs, and that's what actually the Western countries did in their policies. I mean, Switzerland adopted a policy of integrating external costs in the way we organize traffic, in the way we charge the traffic that goes through Switzerland. So then by a sudden this pollution has a value, or keeping it clean becomes a value, and that's what will happen. So you need to globalize those standards, and emission standards are not at all globalized. Yeah, not at all. I mean, many countries have very clean cars today. It's impossible to sell the rest. And what Europe does, we ship our dirty cars to Africa because they don't have any policy. So. And then they buy this dirty diesel, and then guess what? I mean, if you look at the data from these African cities, it's very heavily polluted. Yeah. Franziska.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nino. Very interesting presentation. Could you tell us a little bit what the Swiss Public Health and Tropical Institute is doing besides supporting WHO in these guidelines, for example, specific project in certain countries?
Thank you, Franziska. Is it working? Also online. Okay. Well, the Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute is, of course, it's the biggest academic institute in Switzerland in public health, and environmental health is one of the big topics. So the answer to your question will be a long one. There are, since many years, the department I mentioned from Nicole Probst is leading many projects in Switzerland, but also internationally, and we are involved in giving advice. Sometimes we review what others do, or sometimes we are part of very large collaborative studies, actually very large cohort studies, where we show what these effects are on mortality or on other effects, all in collaborations from almost all over the world. These have become bigger and bigger, these collaborations. Or we work on modeling exposure in not only in Switzerland but all over, to understand what are the levels, also in areas where there is no measurement. We give advice on the policy side sometimes. Of course, the WHO mandate is a personal one, which I was recruited for 5 years just to serve there. So it has many aspects, and for those who want to know more, I mean, on the website you would also see all these projects like Expands, our names, or the old one Escape, or the Sopaldia Study, the Swiss study on air pollution and lung diseases. It started actually with the Sopaldia Study, which is led by Professor Nicole Probst in Basel, which is the only cohort study, national cohort study that is based on the population sample in Switzerland still today, and it has been launched 30 years ago for addressing exactly those questions, long-term effects of air pollution. Yeah. Good.
Thank you very much. It's Balazs Adam from the Institute of Public Health, UAE University. Thank you very much for this excellent presentation, and I very much agree with everything what you've been saying so far. I would like just to point out one aspect of this guidelines, how they should spread all over the world, and copy-pasting is very typical actually in many developing countries, taking over these guidelines from the West. However, there is another aspect for that, because local pollution characteristics might be different in different places, which should be also taken into consideration. I would like just to give one example here, a local example in Abu Dhabi, Dubai. So particulate matter is the number one issue, of course, but and sometimes it's very high, and I mean the levels in the dangerous zone. But it typically depends on meteorological conditions, because it's desert dust, basically, mainly, and it's natural, not man-made, and characteristics are different. So, like, for example, we don't see like this fibrogenic effect like in case of man-made particles, like in the construction industry or in the mining industry. We don't really have that here. However, still these particles can absorb various chemicals on the surface, of course, like diesel exhaust. But on the other hand, that is different here also because, for example, diesel cars, as personal cars, light cars, are not here at all. It's not in the culture. They don't sell diesel cars here, never sold. So in Europe, it's a big issue because diesel car industry developed a lot in the last 20, 30 years, and now it's going back because of these reasons. So the patterns, what I want to make a point on is that these local characteristics might be very different in different places of the world, which should be taken into consideration and not just copy-pasting.
Oh, I fully agree. This is an extremely important point, and as mentioned, I think we should share experience across the world. Approaches must be tailored to the local situation, and I mean this is a region where you have the desert dust, and that is a huge challenge. And if you go to the air quality guidelines, we have a full chapter where we talk about that. So my advice to such countries is on the monitoring side, you would be wise to establish the most modern technologies to separate, I mean, to know where is the particles, where are they coming from, so that you know what is the level due to desert dust and what is the anthropogenic part. So you can monitor that and you can make improvements with that. And of course, the discussion around desert dust is a far more complex one and very, very difficult to achieve solutions. Yeah, but even there, they discuss solutions. So this is very important. And you know, the local situation is totally driven by local policies also. You mentioned the diesel. I mean, it's not by coincidence that you don't have them. Switzerland has never promoted diesel until the diesel got clean. But it was the only country in the middle of Europe, because all these car industry countries around us, they have pushed for the dirty diesels for 20 years. And they have blocked the European Union to adopt the mandate, the policy that you have to put filters. This was postponed for far longer than technologically possible. But your country here, just they did not make these errors. Yeah. So we can also learn from errors we do around the world. Yeah.
Sorry, we have a question from somebody who's viewing online and is an environmental consultant based in the UK. And they have a question here. Perhaps I can pass over so that you... No reading glasses, I see. So perhaps I will read the question out.
Or should I do? So, ask what are the major sources of air pollution in Switzerland compared to other European countries, and how can we act to improve these specifically? Very good question. I mean, Switzerland is just in the middle of Europe, so there is nothing too specific or too different. So traditionally and rightfully, in the last 30 years, we had a strong focus on traffic, and traffic got very, very, very clean, and it's still going down. I mean, pollution from traffic is, of course, there is and was industry, like all over around us, and industries have become much cleaner already 20 years ago. So in terms of sources, today we have new discussions. Wood smoke, particularly in some areas like in the Ticino. Here the Ticino, the Italian-speaking region, is very strongly present in the Swiss pavilion. And the Ticino is a region where you have quite a lot of wood smoke fires for heating. And this has become actually a very good also climate-oriented solution. So there are challenges in keeping air pollution low, but increasing the wood smoke, I mean the wood as a source for energy. And today, this is something we have to be very careful and promote actually only very clean wood stoves, which also exist. So you have to adapt a bit. But else, you have seen the data. I mean, else, honestly, I have to say, in Switzerland, sooner or later, there is not a big problem anymore. And that is, of course, exactly the source of my optimism. I think this can be shared all over the world. There is absolutely no reason why some countries are still going in the wrong direction. I mean, you have heard the costs. It's much more costly to do that. I mean, poor countries cannot afford air pollution. Although it's in people's mind to say, well, we cannot afford clean air. No, it's the other way around. Yeah. Good. Is any other question online? Oh, you have yourself a question. Yeah. Oh, you get one. Sorry.
Hello. Just you mentioned, we've outsourced, if you like, manufacturing to China and various other places. But there, have we got to accept to implement global policies there, perhaps, and to bring them into these sorts of standards in Switzerland is probably going to be quite an incredible achievement to do that. Have we got to accept as part of that there will be an increase in the cost of goods as a result, or I think you were also mentioning that actually the cost is surprisingly counterintuitive, actually. You were saying initially that it is more costly not to have clean air, if you see what I mean. Is there something in that you can explain, if you like, or
Well, I refer to what the US EPA has investigated in understanding these, the costs and benefits of those policies, of all big policies in the last 30 years. And that is their conclusion. And of course, the reason why you come to these numbers is that you integrate all the costs, all the side effects. Okay. And that's not on people's mind. So yes, some countries feel like, well, it's much cheaper for us to do this dirty production, and then we sell things all over the world at a lower price, and yes, that's a business model. Yeah. But of course, in the long term, it's the wrong model because, and you see that also in China, I mean, it has huge economic consequences. And actually, the interesting thing with air pollution, people react. People don't like it. Also, the government people themselves, because everybody suffers. So there is a huge energy in a good movement, in a good direction. And in fact, I mean, I'm very optimistic about China. They have done some excellent decisions, and they go in the right direction. In some areas, they are even examples for us, models for us, how to change the world in a cleaner. To become cleaner in terms of air pollution. And of course it takes time, yes. And that's why I showed you 30 years. I mean, yes, it takes time to come down to where we are now. But 30 years ago, we did not believe this would be possible in Switzerland. Yeah, nobody thought that this would happen. And it is possible. Yeah.
Thank you.
So then, thank you. I think we have run over slightly for time, but it's been very, very interesting indeed, and great that Nino is here with us so that we are able to continue this conversation over the break with a cup of coffee. So that means I invite those who are with us here live to step outside into the sunshine and have a cup of coffee until 1:40. Ready for the next talk then afterwards that begins at 1:45. For those of you who are joining us online, that means that you can also please have a coffee or whatever it is that you like to do during the break, but please be sure to join us again at 10:45 Swiss time. So thank you very much, and enjoy your coffee break. Hello and welcome back from your coffee break, which was hopefully spent nicely. Mine was spent in the sunshine, I am afraid to say, because I see from colleagues that it's raining and not very nice weather in Switzerland. But nevertheless, thank you for joining us once again. And we're looking forward now to the next speaker, who is Professor Martin Rusley from the Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute in Basel. And he'll be talking to us now about too much noise, about the health effects of noise. Let's see. So I am looking forward to handing over the word to Martin Rusley, as I mentioned, who will be joining us online. So I hand the floor over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Can you hear me? And can you see the slides?
Yes.
Perfect. Welcome, everybody. It's really my pleasure today to talk about noise. We expect quite some noise in the next few hours, I think, in the form of thunderstorms. So let's talk a bit what is actually noise. And this is also an experiment on how well this works with audio files. So, for instance, this here from a hike. So very nice ambience in the Swiss Alps during a hike. I hope you could hear the bells of the cows. Is this noise or is this just a nice sound? It may depend a bit on what you are doing. Maybe the same type of cows, if they are presented in another context like that, does it create the same feeling? Maybe not. So we see noise is something which has a subjective component, and there's many things that affect how we perceive noise. Obviously, the level matters. The timing might be relevant. Whether you hear it in the night or in the day may have different effects on you. May also depend whether you have the control of the sound. It can be quite fun to make own noise, but maybe it's less fun if the neighbor is doing noise. In that context, predictability is also playing quite a big role. If you know every Monday at this time there is some noise, it may be less disturbing than if it comes out of the blue. The characteristic of sound may also play a role, whether there's a lot of tone in it. So bells, for instance, have a lot of tone, which is more difficult to neglect. The impulse, if there's a high variability, is also something that makes it more difficult to neglect compared to a more continuous sound. Maybe the attitude to the source is also relevant. If some drunken people are screaming in the middle of the night, you have a different attitude to it compared to maybe air conditioning that you think is providing you fresh air. Distance and orientation to the source may also play a role. If it's very close, it may create more fearful, or if it comes from above, usually people don't like too much compared to if it comes from down. So at the end of the day, the most common definition used in research is basically that noise is unwanted sound, which really implies there's a psychological component to it. But others have also questioned that definition, because also sound that is wanted can create health effects. So for that reason, we may come back to that later in this talk. Here is just an example how the psychology and perception plays a role. What we see here are curves for highly annoyed people from a survey conducted in Switzerland within the Cyrene study of almost 6,000 people answered. And when we answered the questions where they were asked, how annoyed are you because of noise on a scale from 0 to 10? And if the score was 8, 9, or 10, these people are highly annoyed. And now we see here the curve in relation to the decibels level that has been modeled at the place of living place. So the LDN is a 24-hour averages with some penalty for nighttime. And you see if the LDN, this noise level is 60 dB, then about 12% of the population is highly annoyed for road traffic. But if the LDN of railway noise is about 60 dB, then it's about 15%. And for aircraft noise, it's even more than 30%. And this is a common phenomenon also in other countries, that aircraft noise is much more annoying than other sources. And this may have to do with the attitude, with the type of sound that it comes from above. There's a lot of explanations for that, although there's no real proof why this is the case. But the exactly same picture for sleep disturbances. Again, people feel much more sleep disturbed because of aircraft noise than, for instance, because of road traffic noise or railway noise. And the predictability, which is usually low for aircraft noise, may also contribute to that picture. So let's have a look on how noise or sound is processed by us. So if you have some sound sources, it comes to the ear, and then from there's a nerve that brings the sound directly in the brainstem in the so-called ARAS, the ascending reticular activity system. And from there, it goes to the amygdala and hypothalamus, where it is processed, and only at a later stage then also goes in the rest of the brain. So this is very interesting, because this first entry door of the sound, this is what is sometimes also called the reptilian brain. So this is the part of the brain which reacts instinctual, sometimes also called the dinosaur brain. So this is really the basic functions. And then the next level is the limbic brain that processes emotional or feelings. And this easily explains why sound has so much effect on our emotions. So music can create very nice emotions, but it can also, sound can also make us very angry. And that's the reason for that. And it's obviously clear that this type of emotions then also can create stress. And it's very interesting also to realize that the ear never sleeps. So even during night, when, for instance, the visual system is shut down, we still process sound in order to react if there's something dangerous. And of course, this makes complete sense from an evolutionary perspective. So the main model to explain noise effects is the stress model. So with the stress model, it means that if there's a stress on us, we fight or flight. If this is successful, there's end of stress. But for noise, in particular for transportation noise and other noise source, there's not much to fight and not much to flight if it's at home. So at the end, you have a chronic stress. You have an effect on the hormonal system, on the HPA axis, and also on the sympathetic nervous system that reacts and is more alerted. Actually, the German word for noise, the meaning is Lärm, and this word comes from the Italian allarme, to the weapon, and this perfectly explains what happens in the body. So I guess this just shows you how noise can stress. And if you're stressed, then you get all these risk factors for cardiometabolic diseases that get activated. Blood pressure increases, blood lipids go on, blood viscosity increases, and the blood sugar also increases to have more energy to fight or flight. And there's also the direct effect from noise that you cannot sleep. And probably everybody has experienced this in life. If you cannot sleep or if you don't sleep very well, this has an impact on the food intake. There's a preference for fatty food. There's less motivation for physical activity. And also it affects the autonomous nervous system directly. So there's a lot of effects all related to cardiometabolic biomarkers. And so we wanted to check that empirically, and this is one study among several that has been conducted, the Swiss National Cohort Study, where we looked into the mortality of all inhabitants in Switzerland between 2000 and 2015. And we have linked that to modeled noise. As you can see here, for each building in Switzerland, we have done several facades points that have been modeled based on input data, railway lines, roads, airports, and so on, also taking into account noise barriers. And very important, noisy areas are not very popular, so people, not everybody may like to live there. So it's also important in this type of study to control for basic factors like the socioeconomic position, which is also related to health. So we looked whether people died from cardiovascular disease, where they were more or less exposed than people who do not die. And what you can see here is a main result of that study. On the one hand, we see the road traffic noise distribution. So this is the gray histogram. And we see the red line, the WHO noise guidelines. And you see, even in Switzerland, which is usually not perceived as a very noisy country, about 50% of the population is exposed to road traffic noise, which is above the guidelines for noise, according to the World Health Organization. And then when we look at the effects, it looks like a straight line that the risk to die from cardiovascular disease is continuously increasing with increasing noise. And the interesting stuff here is this is not a linear model a priori. Actually, this is a kind of spline model, so a non-parametric model. So this curve could have taken every form, but just based on the data. And it turned out that it's quite continuously increasing, which is somehow not a surprise for environmental epidemiologists. Mino Künzli has shared some results on air pollution, and there it's the same thing. Even below the regulatory limits, there's already some kind of risk increase, and it's usually quite continuously going up the risk. So we have looked a bit broader also in railway noise and air traffic noise. Obviously, these two sources are much less common compared to road traffic noise in most of the countries. And then we also looked separately in myocardial infarction, and you see for all these sources more or less an increase, a little bit less pronounced for air traffic noise. And one explanation could be that in Switzerland, the largest airport in Zurich has a traffic ban during night from 11 to 7 to 6, and this may help to prevent some of the effects. If you look at it in a linear way, that the risk increase is about 2%, 4% per 10 decibel increase in noise. So when we look a bit back into the neurobiological mechanisms for these observed effects, there was a very interesting study published 2 years ago in 500 adults, a cohort, a small cohort, and they have measured amygdalar metabolic activity and inflammation, and then follow these people for 4 years on average, and 40 of them developed a major cardiovascular disease event. And it's clearly can be seen from the graph here, the people who had less noise, so the blue ones below 50 decibels, they were less likely to experience such a major event compared to those who were highly exposed. And very interesting, the amygdalar metabolic rate was completely different in people that had a major adverse event and were high noise exposed compared to those with low noise and no cardiovascular events. So they have modeled this data and could clearly prove the theoretical concept that noise is related to the amygdalar activity, that this creates inflammation and at the end leads to a cardiovascular event. We also looked into acute event, and I just see that the time is a bit, I prepared a bit for a longer talk, so I will skip that. But shortly, in brief, we looked into the acute effect from noise, and it's well known that if you have very strong emotions, that this can trigger a cardiovascular event. And in this study of around the airport of Zurich, where we evaluated 25,000 deaths that occurred between 2000 and 2015, we could prove that even if you adjusted for temperature effect and air pollution effect, we could see that nighttime noise was associated with the acute effect that occurred 2 hours prior to death. We could not see any effect on daytime noise. On daytime, we could not see that the nighttime noise had an effect on daytime death. It was really the acute effect, and this was related to nighttime effects. So you see here that the increase in noise. We have heard about the Sopaldia study led by Professor Nicole Probst-Hensch at the Swiss TPH. And in this study that was originally designed to look into air pollution effect, obviously one can also look into noise effects. And this has been done. And we could see that also diabetes was related to the transportation noise, significantly to road traffic noise, even stronger, although not significant because there was not that much aircraft noise in that study, to aircraft noise and not that much to railway noise, which is pretty much in line with other studies here shown as a meta-analysis. You see almost all the studies conducted so far. There are far less studies conducted than for air pollution, but still there are quite a few that see that road traffic noise is associated with diabetes, whereas studies on aircraft and railway is less prevalent. Again, non-parametric modeling shows pretty much a linear association. And what is interesting, if we looked and just focus on the green box here, if we looked into people that say they are not annoyed because of their transportation noise, actually saw almost the same effects as people who are annoyed. And the same for noise sensitivity, which can be measured by well-developed scales. Again, the same effect whether people are claiming to be noise sensitive or not. So the perceived psychological impact of noise is not a precondition to have health effects. So even people who don't feel disturbed can suffer from noise at the end. In the lab, we could see that also this effect on the glucose response and glucose tolerance is related to noise. I don't want to go into detail now because of time issues. And we could also see, and that's very important aspect, that noise is also related to mental health. Which was slightly visible in the Sopaldia study, but also in other studies, there's a significant effects observed. And you can imagine to study mental health in relation to noise is even more challenging because mental health is self-perceived health also, and people who feel that noise has an impact on their health, that they don't feel very well about noise, they may move out. So there's a lot of methodological issues, but still one can see that there are such associations. The European Environmental Agency has quantified what is the effect of noise in Europe, and they concluded that about 22 million people are highly disturbed because of, or highly annoyed because of noise. 6.5 million are highly disturbed, and every year 48,000 ischemic heart disease cases occur in Europe because of noise, and thereof 12,000 people are dying. So noise is certainly an impact, and Nino Künzli has before told that Switzerland has a policy of making the costs of pollution, bringing it into the policy. And so that is why we calculate these external costs every year. And you see air pollution is the highest external cost contributor from traffic, but also noise creates 2.8 billion Swiss francs costs every year that are not covered by the polluters, but has to be covered by the society in general. So here are the WHO noise guidelines for the European region. I've already mentioned they are far from fulfilled in most countries. So also in Switzerland, there's a lot to do. And obviously we can do a lot of things. Noise can be prevented. And as for air pollution, it's the same here. We have to prevent at the source, if that's really preferable. For instance, for aircraft noise, speed limit, quiet road surfaces, low noise tires, less heavy vehicles would have a lot of impact on noise, but is not fully explored yet. Noise barriers are usually, and noise insulation windows is usually the first thing that people comes into people's mind, but actually that is on the propagation path and less effective and less useful because it does not protect the whole environment. Here, just an example, we evaluated for the city of Lausanne, what would be the health benefit if speed limits of 30 kilometers per hour are introduced in the whole city. And here is the scenario without main road, but all other roads would have 30 kilometer speed limit. And this would prevent in a relatively small city as Lausanne every year 2 cardiovascular deaths, more than 100 hospital deaths, and quite a lot of people of highly annoyed and highly sleep disturbed people. Quite interesting. Usually speed limits are introduced because to prevent crashes and accidents, but actually the benefit for noise-induced health effects is even higher than what you prevent in terms of crashes and accidents. So to conclude, noise is the second most relevant environmental health burden after air pollution. This is a study from Europe, but it's probably also the case in other parts of the world. I think it's not true that this is just a cultural issue. Noise has a physiological effects all over the world, and every culture is affected by it. And there's actually still relatively little awareness about this. I mean, there's quite some awareness about air pollution, but about noise and the negative impact, there's much less evidence. Although the health effects are there, and there's increasingly research demonstrating different health effects of cardiometabolic disease and mental health. And subjectively, we feel that we can habituate to noise, but from a physiological point of view, a lot of studies show that this is not the case. We may not wake up anymore because the sound is familiar to us, but still the same physiological reaction may happen when we are exposed to noise during night. And as I said, even people who are not annoyed by noise, they can be affected by noise in terms of health effects. And most important to mitigate the measure is to really take measures at the source. So before I take the last questions, let's have a little bit the sound of Switzerland, and then I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Okay.
So thank you very, very much for your very interesting talk. And I wonder how many of us would admit that our singing in the shower is in line with the definition of unwanted sound, but hopefully not too bad that it would cause any cardiac arrest in the night. Hopefully not. I think people are keen to ask you questions about this very interesting topic, and as you said, about a topic that is sort of underknown about and not enough awareness for it. So thank you for bringing it to our attention here at the Swiss Pavilion and for those online. If there are any questions coming from online, then we'd be very happy to answer them. Please write them in the virtual space for questions. And if those of you have questions here live, then please feel free to ask away.
Hello. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. I was wondering, is there a difference between constant sound and interrupted sound, even though it's noise? Does it have an impact on the health if it's constant?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. We looked into that and we hypothesized that if it's more interrupted sound, that this may have stronger effects, particularly in the night, because you may get used to a continuous sound from a highway, let's say, a bit further distance, compared to if it's very much intermittent. What we saw was that there was a tendency, it plays an effect, but it really depends on how long are the quiet periods. So the strongest effects we found for intermittent sound with a high repetition rate, if there's just a few events during night, then actually we didn't see that much of health effects, except that the average level, of course, determines then the effect.
Thank you. We did start a bit late, so we are sort of running short on time in terms of meeting the schedule. But perhaps we have time for one more quick question before we move on to the next speaker.
Okay. Hello. It's probably a bit of a stupid question, but in terms of, do we know why individuals are more susceptible to the effects of sound as opposed to other individuals? Is there a common physiological, what do you call it, reason, physiological reason for that?
It was just an email coming in, so I didn't hear that. Who is more susceptible?
Yeah, no. Do we know the reasons why some people physiologically are more susceptible to sound than others?
Okay, I think this is still not very well investigated. I feel it also depends a bit on the general situation. So what is the general stress level, and so probably all of us are aware of this. Sometimes we are quite robust to noise, and it's not much disturbing. But if you are already highly distressed, then a little bit noise may be very, very much annoying. And I think what is true within a person also is probably to some extent true between person. Although I'm convinced there are also other aspects why some people can easier just hear away than others. I guess this is also a type of personality, how easy you can do that.
Okay, so it's more a mental issue than a physical bodily issue. Yeah,
I think it's both. I mean, on the physical point of view, I think there's really little research on individual sensitivity. So far, mostly has been done related to perceived annoyance, self-reported annoyance, and there these differences has been seen. I think it's very difficult to predict who is then physiologically quite different. We had done a study in people during sleep where they carried an actimeter and we measured movements and then related that to the sound. And what is interesting that the correlation between movements and sound was even more pronounced in people who said that they were not annoyed. So it's really quite some distinct, I would say, process, what is going on physiological and what is perceived by the people themselves. And yeah, for physiological, we still have a little bit less information on systematic evaluation in terms of susceptibility.
Thank you very much.
So yes, thank you very, very much for joining us. It's been brilliant to have you here, join us live streamed to the Swiss Pavilion. So thank you for your time. And at this point then, it's time for our next speaker. So it's a pleasure for me to be able to introduce our next speaker who's also joining online. And it's Professor Niccolo Cupini, from the Competent Center for Labor, Welfare and Social Research, the University of Applied Sciences and Arts of Southern Switzerland, SUPSI. And he'll be talking to us about rethinking post-pandemic cities, a very, very relevant topic indeed. So it's a pleasure for me to hand over the floor to you. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks a lot for inviting me and welcome to everybody. In my speech today, I will briefly try to show you how historically pandemics have been one of the main vectors that have transformed the urban, and later on I will try to give you an idea of what are the current scenario that we as a species are prefiguring as an output of this pandemic. However, it's quite a fact that nothing in modern history has changed city life quite like COVID has. So from the closure of city centers to the many restrictions, pandemic precautions have transformed the landscape of cities across the world, likely for the long term. In fact, the pandemic is the first of its scale to happen to us as an urbanized species. When the Spanish flu hit in the early 90s, only 40% of humans lived in cities. But today, the figure has risen up to almost 60%, according to estimates by the UN Population Division. So as a result, cities have had to become even more vigilant in terms of health protections and overall security to better protect their population. To clarify what changes have led to higher safety, the Economic Intelligence Unit recently released the 2021 Safe Cities Index, which ranks 60 cities based on 76 safety indicators across infrastructure, digital life, personal security, environmental factors, and, of course, health, with pandemic preparedness and COVID-19 mortality included this year. Those ranked at the top of the index, including Copenhagen, Toronto, Singapore, Sydney, and Tokyo, all add factors that illustrate how overall safety correlates to a strong sense of social cohesion, total population inclusion, and societal trust. However, as I previously said, the link between epidemics and urban condition and transformation is anything but new. So I will try to give you some genealogical insights by starting from I hope you can see my presentation, by starting from a book by Michel Foucault called Discipline and Punish, in which he attempted to define the new disciplinary order of power, of urban power, through the convergence of two paradigms that had hitherto remained distinct: leprosy and plague. I would like to use this Foucauldian scheme to clarify a description of the urban space of modernity. So the paradigm of leprosy is one of exclusion. It is a question of putting lepers outside the city, of creating a clear distinction between the outside and the inside. The ideal here is that of a pure community, which constitutes the model of what Foucault calls the grand enfermament. The plague gives rise to an entirely different paradigm. Since the outbreak of the epidemic makes it impossible to exclude the plague victims, it is then a question of dividing, supervising, and controlling every street, in every neighborhood, every house in every street, and every household in every house, whose members are registered in advance. Each street is placed under the authority of the mayor, who is in charge of its supervision. On the appointed day, each family must lock itself in its house and is forbidden to leave on pain of death. Only soldiers, doctors, and the grave diggers are allowed to circulate and are entrusted with the task of permanent surveillance and registration. Within the city, the zones were divided according to the intensity of the pandemic, disinfection, and quarantine. While the leper is caught up in a practice of exclusion and rejection, the afflicted person is encapsulated, monitored, controlled, and treated through a complex system in which individual differentiations are the effect of a power that multiplies, articulates, and subdivides. And I'm quoting, leprosy and its separation, the plague and its subdivision. The one is branded, the other analyzed and subdivided. Exiling the leper and stopping the plague do not entail the same political dream. One is that of a pure community, the other that of a disciplined society. Two ways of exerting power over men and controlling their relations, of undoing their dangerous entanglement. I hope you can still see my presentation. According to Foucault, these two political powers of modernity results from the convergence and overlap of those two paradigms. It is a question of treating lepers as plague victims and plague victims as lepers, of projecting the articulated and distributed space of the disciplines onto the simple space of internment, of individualizing the excluded and using the process of individualization to determine exclusions. So the result is the superimposition of a dry binary position, such as inclusion, exclusion, healthy, sick, normal, abnormal, of a series of differential visions, strategies, and devices aimed at subjectifying, individualizing, and controlling subject. So if we try to apply this dual paradigm of... Sorry? This way? Okay, sorry, thank you. So if you apply this dual paradigm to urban space, we have a first outline for understanding the new metropolitan space of the West. So it is a complex scheme within which simple devices of exclusion and division of the leprosy type coexist with a complex articulation of spaces and their inhabitants of the plague type in order to produce a global government of men and things. So here I stop the most boring part of my presentation, the more theoretical, and I just want to conclude this genealogical narration by saying that epidemics helped shape the modern metropolis since the past, and especially in the 19th century, diseases and epidemics were included as long-standing epidemics threats like smallpox, typhus, yellow fever, and scarlet fever. In addition, cholera emerged as an epidemic threat and spread worldwide in 6 pandemics in the 19th century. The third plague pandemic emerged in China in the mid-19th century and spread worldwide in the 90s. And just to conclude, we have to say that at that time, the metropolises were often seen as infected bodies. And so the urban discipline used to have at its core the idea of sanifying the city, of sanifying urban spaces. So just to, again, to conclude this genealogical part, I must say that to come back to the present, we are thinking about anything but new if we think in terms of how a pandemic or more generally a health question transforms the urban space, and this is more important, how this will transform our urban future. So we could say that in these couple of years, we are living in a sort of laboratory for rethinking to see in a positive way the ways in which we will live together in the future. Just to recall the title of the Biennale of Architecture that took place this year in Venice. So now I want to give you a sense of this possible urban future by giving you some ideas from the global debate that is ongoing about, again, how to deal with the pandemic, but more generally, how to transform and rethink urban spaces. So I showed you some pictures from the 19th century metropolises dealing with pandemic questions, and now I pass through these through three main kind of scenarios that are at stake in this moment. So the first scenario that is that of possible alternative urban models. I have to say that in the midst of this lingering pandemic, some great questions, some huge, big questions emerged, whether cities are still desirable places to live and work in. And many designers and architects, but also engineers and designers, are posing a provocative question about the possibility to think a new paradigm, a new model. Many people are saying that the experience of working remotely, just to give you an example, the so-called smart work, doesn't make sense to think to come back to previous buildings and the previous ways of living. So there are many proposals emerging for new urban design projects that emphasize well-being, mental health, and strengthening the social ties across generations in the recovery period following the COVID-19 pandemic. So these ideas are prioritizing the reconnection, first of all, between people and nature. So large urban areas are losing the delicate balance that used to bind the settled community and physical space in order to respond more and more often to the needs of a wider global society, of which they represent the mere physical precipitate. So first, the environmental issue and then the health emergency have, on the other hand, undermined one of the founding dimensions of cities, linked to the densification and concentration on functions and services, and with it the corresponding settlement models of large urban agglomerations. So the emergency protocols activated in the lockdown and the so-called state of exception have posed, as I previously said, this threat to the possibilities of reproducing the ways in which urban circulation and flows used to work. Alternative settlement models are therefore being proposed once again, networks of small and medium-sized cities, intermediate cities, rural settlements as a new way for rethinking a distributed urbanization, which relaunch low-density housing and the recovery of the environmental dimension as a guarantee for a better life quality of life, and in the post-COVID era of an adequate distance from pandemic flows. So even before the current crisis, the flight from the cities and the repopulation of small rural and mountain villages in closer contact with the natural environment were the subject of specific development strategy, like the urban agenda, which seem in this phase to have found new impetus, not only in the micropolises of the sector. So this is a first scenario. The in which, as you see from this image, the point is exactly to rethink the balance between urban function, to rethink the density model, and to totally redesign the territorial organization. The second scenario is that of the so-called 15 minutes city, which is a residential urban concept in which most daily necessities can be accomplished by either walking or cycling from residents' home. The concept was popularized by the Paris measure Anne Hidalgo and inspired by the French Colombian scientist Carlos Moreno. And in this image, you can see a model, if you want, of a 15-minute city based on Paris. So 15-minute cities are built from a series of 5-minute neighborhoods, also known as complete communities or walkable neighborhoods. And if you want, this concept is a sort of return to a local way of life, which is on one hand the opposite of what I previously said of the first scenario, but at the same time, the idea is quite the same. So the question is to reconstruct a sort of local way of life, but in this case, within the cities that we know. So in this scenario, the pandemic emergency has sanctioned the fracture of the relationship between space and function as constructed over the last 100 years, but this condition can lead to a general rethinking of spaces and the built heritage in relation to their functions urgent in terms of regeneration, reuse, and new use, undermine the intervention model and tools used until now. So the point is not escaping the cities, but radically thinking the city. So streets should be redesigned and as an up wave to rethink urban circulation and urban living, more green spaces, more urban parkways, new healthy buildings in which the quality of air should be guaranteed, and so on and so forth. So even in this case, as in the previous scenario, there are global institutions that are working on this scenario. In July 2020, the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group published a framework for cities to build back better using the 15 minutes city concept. And here the examples are Milan, Madrid, Edinburgh, and Seattle. So this, and also Barcelona is an important reference point here, and the Barcelona municipality launched a document in which there are 4 key elements for building the 15-minute city. The reorganization of mobility is the first key. The second is the renaturalization of the city. The third is the decommodification of housing, and the fourth is the so-called growth. So I'm going to conclude with the last point of my presentation, which is about the so-called 1 hour city, which is slightly different from the previous 2 scenario, and which is really about rethinking the very nature of what a city is. It is not necessarily opposed to the previous both scenarios, but it's quite different because it stresses the necessity to don't rethink the urban in terms of the local, but to rethink the urban in terms of a new way of connecting, a new way of circulating, a new way of thinking infrastructures. And in this sense, the point is that the pandemic has shown how the point is the interconnection that characterizes the contemporary global urban. It's quite well known how the planetary urbanization has made the pandemic spreading so fastly. So the idea of the 1 hour city is the idea to rethinking the possibility to move and to go wherever you want in almost 1 hour. But in this way, we can guarantee a healthier and safer urban life by redistributing the population and the infrastructures. In this idea of the 1 hour city, it's not only a question about the ways in which we used to move before the pandemic, because a new actor is powerfully entering in this discourse, which is the so-called platformization of urban life. This morning, my colleague Filippo Bignami already presented you many concepts on that, so I don't want to come back to this point, but it's a matter of fact that digital platforms are emerging within the pandemic as the new urban and social infrastructures of contemporary life. So I think that the idea of the 1 hour city should be enforced also by conceptualizing it within this more general framework. So to conclude, I tried to show you how historically pandemics and health questions have been a turning points for redefining the cities and urban life more generally. And I tried to show you 3 of the main scenarios that are emerging as a response to the pandemic and as a possible urban alternative future. So I think that it's really a strategic question to consider health and the urban as intricate, juxtaposed, and 2 necessary poles of the same problematic. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Niccolò. At this time, we can take questions and any comments and feedback as usual. If anybody, as I said, has any questions for the online viewers, then please feel free to write these questions underneath. And if there are no questions, then please, those who are joining us here live, please feel free to use this time to ask your questions. I already have a question here at the front.
Hi there, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'm interested as to what you think, or what do you predict will be the biggest change to infrastructure that you think we will see as a result of this pandemic?
If I correctly got the question, because I didn't hear very well, the point of infrastructure I tried to focus on in my presentation is that we are assisting to a juxtaposition of previous ways of infrastructuring the urban, meaning logistics, urban logistics, and more concretely also street life and and railways and so on and so forth. So this long history of infrastructures. On the other hand, we are assisting to a new way of organizing previous infrastructures and a new emerging infrastructure that is the digital infrastructurization. So we are assisting also to a sort of conflict between these two rationalities, the material infrastructures and the digital infrastructures. And from my perspective, the future will be the result of this merging of these different logics and rationalities of infrastructures. And we have seen how circulation has been the main element emerged during these couple of years as the necessity to rethink how we circulate in the world, the so-called block of the supply chain, the urban mobility, and so on and so forth. And I think that we need to try to use as better as we can the potential that digitalization of infrastructure can give us, but at the same time to avoid the main the risks that are implied in this digitalization, because of course there are many risks. There is no time to go in depth in this, but yeah, the digital infrastructure, I think, is the new frontier that we are entering into. It's quite banal, but
Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions here or? Oh, okay.
Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned at one point build back better. And my question is, since we already have this issue with not having enough housing for a lot of people, on a global scale, and in the West particularly, how do you envisage this build back better? Because it also implies that you have to basically get rid of something first before you can build back better. Is it realistic to implement all these new things if we're lacking in infrastructure in the first place?
You mentioned a quite crucial point. It is of the West and the global, meaning that, of course, I tried to do a quite general presentation, but of course, when we talk in global terms, we also need to be aware that there are many differences when we talk about the urban from Switzerland or European perspective. We are not talking of the same urban of Dubai or of Kinshasa or of New Delhi or whatever. So this is a crucial point. And on one hand, we have commonalities in the trends of urban development, but on the other hand, we have really crucial and deep differences that have to be taken into account. So just thinking about one side of this question, so the development, the future development of Western cities, I think that one of the main intriguing provocations that have been made in the last years is that of rethinking the functions or the functions of the buildings, and this implies also housing. That means to go beyond the vision of a functionalized city and a functionalized building, meaning that we should go beyond the idea of the house as the house, the office as the office, the marketplace as the marketplace, but to try to imagine a more mixed function of, again, buildings and cities. So in this way, rather than constructing more and more and more, we should try to find ways for reliving in different ways the spaces that we already have.
Thank you very, very much for joining us and for answering all the questions, as well as addressing everyone on this very important issue at the moment. At this time, we're going to be closing our session. A round of applause from all of us here who are watching you live. Thank you very much. With that being said, we are now wrapping up the end of the first session. Thank you for having joined us online from wherever you are watching this from. The next session that will be taking place is also an SSPH Plus session, which is led by Frontiers Switzerland, which is a leading publishing journal. And they are talking about young minds for healthy lives on a healthy planet. Specifically, they will be looking at the Frontiers for Young Minds, which is a scientific journal, and they will be inviting children to get involved somehow in science to see what that somehow means. Then come and tune in. It's at 4 o'clock Dubai time, so that's 3 hours behind in Switzerland. Please stay tuned, and do stay tuned also for the rest of our events. We have a fantastic lineup for the next 1 to 2 days still, so keep your eye on our SSPH Plus at Expo event program, and we hope to have you with us, joining us for the rest of our time today and for the next days to come. Thank you.